it going everyone? Sean here, and today I'm going to be going through how to create some awesome sounding guitar solos. I've got some tips and tricks here for you to make sure that you are able to get running as soon as possible creating your own guitar solos. I hope you enjoy this video. Please subscribe if you watched my previous videos and you like what I'm doing. If you enjoyed this video and this is your first time here, also please subscribe. But I will say I've got loads of awesome content coming up, so it's definitely worth your while. Okay, so creating guitar solos is a pretty broad spectrum. What I'm going to try and do here is categorize it into two parts. The first one being philosophy, which sounds really strange, just hear me out. And the second one being creativity. And then at the very end, I'm going to have a load of tips for you on top. All solos begin in the mind, and then they are translated to the guitar itself. So let's get into the first part, part one, philosophy. Let's have a look at some of the mental approaches you should take when embarking on creating a guitar solo. Approach one, your guitar solo is meant to enhance the song in some way. If it's not enhancing the song, then there's no point having it in the first place. Usually a guitar solo adds something just before the song gets stale. Usually with most popular songs, you've got intro, verse, chorus, and then the guitar solo or the bridge section. The thing is that they've heard the verse twice, they've heard the chorus twice. This is why the guitar solo comes in when it does. It's because it avoids the song getting too repetitive. And you will have heard loads of vocals at this point. So the guitar solo is meant to bring something new to the table. So it's there to keep the listener's interest and to keep them listening to the song. This is a really important point, number one, because this is the foundation of why we have guitar solos. It's there to enhance the song, first and foremost. Number two, your guitar solo should create a certain feeling of vibe that your listener is able to pick up on. If your solo doesn't impact somehow on the listener at all, then it's not going to be a very effective guitar solo. There are all different types of feelings that you can generate from your solo for the listener. It can be hopeful, inspired, a whole range of different emotions just based off the notes that you choose and the way you phrase them. So it's your job as the soloist to make sure that these feelings are transferred from your solo to your audience. So your solo is there to enhance the feeling of the song or to create a whole new feeling entirely. Number three, think of guitar solos as a form of communication in relation to language. Written language has full stops, commas, exclamation marks, amongst many other tools in punctuation and grammar. You wouldn't read without taking a pause, and you definitely wouldn't talk without taking a pause either. Pauses are useful because they allow you to comprehend what's just been said in a clear and concise manner. The gaps make meaning between the different pieces of information. Likewise, in a guitar solo, it's essential to have gaps in between the different phrases in order to help the listener generate meaning of what you've just performed. Gaps are a way to make sense of what you're trying to say musically. The gaps between phrases are just as important as the phrases themselves. I like to think of the long gaps between phrases as full stops, the short gaps as commas, and the exclamation marks like articulation or a screaming guitar bend at the 24th fret. The musical phrases in the solo, therefore, would be clauses in grammatical terms. Number four, the guitar solo should always be melodic first and shredfest second. If you don't have a strong melody, then you don't really have a strong foundation of which to build the framework of your guitar solo. A strong melody glues everything together. That is to say, if you start with a shredfest first, then it's the opposite way around of how it should be. It'd be like building a house upside down. The first thing you should be doing when building a house is layering the foundations. And in music, that means starting with the melody first. Once we've got the melody, then we can add other things into the mix to spice things up a bit. The fast technical parts of your solo should be there to complement the melodic elements. Otherwise, instead of a guitar solo, you just get a technical exercise. And no one wants to listen to technical exercises other than musicians and guitar players. Think of the melody and the phrasing as the bare bones of your solo and everything that's necessary, and then the shred parts to be the icing on the cake. You wouldn't want it the other way around because it just end up a mess and fall flat on itself. To have it any other way would be backward. Number five, melodic phrasing first, technique last. Same rules apply with this one as they did with the previous. Just because someone has great technique and can play fast doesn't mean that they can create a great melody. And so sometimes that's what you see in a lot of technical guitar players. They get too obsessed with the technique and trying to show off to other guitar players that they forget about the melody and it just doesn't sound as good as they think it does. Being a great composer of a guitar solo is not the same as being a great shredder or a great technician. Being a great composer of a guitar solo is not the same as being a great technician on the guitar or being a shredder. These are all different skills rather than being the same thing, which people often get confused with. I've heard so many technique monsters on guitar write solos that aren't very good because they've got too bogged down with the technique and trying to make that as impressive as possible, rather than focusing on the melodic elements and getting the foundations correct first, as we've already discussed. So to summarise, speed and technique should be there to serve the song, not the other way around. They make a poor master. Number 6, shred parts of your solo should be placed tactically and in sporadic moments between your phrases in order to gain maximum impact on your listener. Have you ever listened to a solo that is only shred? I can think of a couple of examples myself. It's probably engaging for 7 seconds, but anything more than that, it just becomes uninspiring and repetitive. And this is how your listeners find it when they're listening to really fast guitar for a long time. It just has less and less and less effect. The purpose of a fast section in a solo is to peak the energy of that solo, but that momentum only has a short peak value, meaning it doesn't last very long. Therefore, use the fast parts to really wow the listener when you want that to happen, but use them tactically. But don't overdo it because it loses its effectiveness fast, and you won't be able to pique the interest of the listener again. Number 7, keep your ego in check. Does the song really need to have a 2-minute solo that's an absolute shred fest in A minor? I mean, it might be fun for you, but is it really fun for the listener, and is it fun for your band? After all, you're meant to be working as a team together. It's about the whole rather than the individual parts. And what I mean by the parts is the band members. Instead of every man for himself, you should be working as one cohesive unit. This is also called synergy, and it's why we work in bands rather than individuals. So in regards to that mindset of having synergy and working as one cohesive unit, really make sure, and this goes back a little bit to point number 1, is to make sure that your solo is focusing on enhancing the song rather than enhancing your own ego. Think of the song as a collective. Your aim is to create the best music possible, not the best guitar solo possible for other guitar players. You'll find that if you adopt this philosophy of working for the greater good of everyone in your band and your audience, that actually your decision making will be a lot better with regard to solos. Enhance the song first, then worry about the fast shred parts. Alright, so that is the philosophy side of things. This has helped me tremendously over time. We're going to move on to part 2 now. So let's move on to part 2, which is creativity. Number 1, start with one good phrase. Yep, I said it. One good phrase. Not 2, not 3, only 1. And if you can't find one, then keep going until you do. Because all you need to create awesome solos is one good idea. This is the only goal to start with solos, because once you've got one good idea, that then inspires and influences the next idea, which then inspires the next idea and the next idea after that. And before you know it, you've got a whole entire solo. And this works because they all inspire each other in a row of succession. It's almost like a ripple effect in water. Each phrase inspires the next until, before you know it, you've got a whole entire guitar solo. You just have to find the beginning. Each new phrase informs you of what needs to come next and how it should sound. So trust the process. Number 2, avoid box shapes, scales and patterns. Nothing feels less creative than being stuck in a scale or a box pattern on guitar. It's the most frustrating thing ever. It can almost feel like a prison cell. So even though scales and box shapes and patterns are useful, they're only useful as a last resort. And I think the trick is, with really good solo composition, is to put them in your subconscious and try and just draw from inspiration and what sounds good on the fretboard, rather than thinking, oh, what scale is it in? Oh, what box shape am I using? So they're for an emergency really, unless you're improvising, in which case you need them a little bit more. But sticking to soloing, try not to use them at all unless it's a last resort. I just find in general that focusing on scales and box patterns and stuff, as useful as they are, when you're composing actual solos, it doesn't lead to anything inspiring. You kind of feel stuck in a rut and you feel like you have to stay within those shapes, which really hinders on your creativity. So try and put it in your subconscious. You know, you might even know that you're working in minor, you might know you're working in major, or you're working in Dorian mode or Mixolydian mode, but try not to focus it too much and try not to think about what those patterns would then be in the key that you're working in. And I'll give you a little tip with this right now. What I like to do, so that I'm not feeling like I'm stuck in a box position, is I like to try and stick to one string when I'm creating the very first melody. And I find that it creates something that I've never actually played before. And this is where the inspiration starts ticking with all the new ideas that come later. Number 3, complete the solo within a few days. Otherwise, you might find that you lose perspective on what's good about your solo and what's not so good about your solo when you come to refine it. It's better to keep going when the inspiration really kicks in and whilst you've still got fresh ears. After a few days, your ears will be really tired from listening to the same solo over and over and over again, and you'll be less able to analyze your guitar solo critically to see how you could improve it. And what will happen ultimately is what you hear will be very different to what other people will hear. And when you're creating guitar solos, especially when you're trying to communicate something emotionally to the audience, you need to make sure that you're able to do that. So that's why I recommend to not go longer than 3 days creating your guitar solo. You just won't have the same perspective that other people will. Number 4, don't be afraid to get rid of parts of your guitar solo for better ones. Sometimes I've done this on the very first phrase that starts the solo and just decided that it's not as good as everything else that I've written since. So if you can replace them with better parts, then do so by all means. Sometimes your old parts are just not as good as the new parts in other places of the solo, so you need to find something better. Just is the way it is. Number 5, and the last one for creativity. Use the chord progressions to outline your phrasing when soloing. Sometimes you'll find one chord out of an entire chord sequence that just completely throws you off. And sometimes you just can't figure out why. And that happens quite a lot in music to make the music sound a little bit more interesting. Sometimes composers will add something in there that shouldn't really be in there that makes it modal or something of that sort. Other times you just cannot fathom what to play over a particular chord that just sticks out in the chord progression. So the best way to tackle this is to figure out what the chord is first and foremost, and then look at its relationship to the rest of the chord progression and see if it outlines a different mode or a different scale to what you've been playing so far. I know this kind of goes against what I was saying before about scales and box shapes and things like this, but if you do get to a point where you're just really stuck, then draw from the scales and try and find a solution with regards to what to do next in your soloing. It might be that that chord that sticks out just implies a completely different mode, which is what actually happened to me with my solo from Pathway that I did in collaboration with JDC Music. If you haven't seen my solo with JDC, it's called Pathway. It's here in the suggestions so that you know what I'm talking about. So I figured out that that particular chord was outlining a Mixolydian flat 6. And once I figured that out, I just created some licks in Mixolydian flat 6 that I thought sounded good over that chord, and it was perfect. It just worked. So it's only for that one particular chord that I'd revert back to Mixolydian flat 6. The rest of the time I was just staying in major. Right, so that's the 2 sections. We're going to move on to some very quick tips that don't strictly fall into either of the 2 categories. So here we go, additional tips. Remember that your music is for the general public, not other musicians. You shouldn't ever feel like you have to do something just to prove a point to other musicians. You know, musicians make a tiny percentage of the overall general population. So don't focus on them. If your solo sounds good, it's good. It doesn't matter whether it's in Mixolydian flat 6 or it's Dorian, or if you have no idea what these things mean, it doesn't make your solo inferior to someone who uses Mixolydian flat 6 or Phrygian or whatever the case may be. Just because they know what that means doesn't mean their solo's better, or it doesn't mean that their solo's better just because they used it. Always trust your ears, number 1. No one in the general public is going to go, "Oh, really nice solo that." Shame that he went from melodic minor and transitioned from bar 4 into a chromatic passage which then led to Dorian in bar 6. Avoid cliché sounding licks. Yes, cliché licks have the purpose. If you're starting out and you're a beginner, then cliché licks is something you need to learn in order to know the foundations of rock guitar or metal guitar or whatever it is that you're playing. Great to learn the licks from the greats and then adapt them into your own playing. No issue with that whatsoever. I'm talking to intermediate and advanced guitar players here who just are too lazy to actually make their own licks. So make sure that you're not just playing cliches because they're easy. Really think about what it is that you're doing. Try and make something that's interesting sounding. Just avoid cliches because you'll just sound like everyone else. The trick is to try and sound like you as best you can. And yes, we're all influenced by different things. I'm not saying that. Just try and make your own licks as best you can and avoid the cliches. Unless you want to sound like a tribute band. Create an ongoing bag of licks and phrases that you can use in your future solos as a guitar player. So what I try to do when I'm home and I'm practicing is not just practice, but also come across new phrasing and new licks. So that's something I'm able to do quite a bit. I might do an interesting picking sequence or a sequence of notes that I wouldn't normally do. I might just find a bunch of different notes that sound great together and that creates a new phrase. What I do is I try to memorize these licks and phrases and I try to save them on my iPhone by recording them. And the benefit of that is before I've even picked up the guitar, I potentially have hundreds of ideas already that are going to fit seamlessly into this solo idea I have. If you're going to steal other people's guitar licks, at least don't make it so obvious. Alright, I'm only joking. We all steal from each other anyway. I mean, it's just the nature of guitar. We're all influenced by different people, as I said before. It's okay to steal other people's guitar licks as long as you are making them your own. It might be messing with the rhythm, messing with the intervals. Just adapt it at least a little bit so that it becomes your own, is what I'm saying. If you're feeling frustrated by guitar solos and composing guitar solos gets easier over time. Practice makes perfect. Short and sweet, that tip. Don't get frustrated. The more solos you make, the better you'll get at it. Simple solos are just as great as technical solos. You don't need a technical solo or a solo that has fast playing in every single instance. There'll be times where it's not appropriate to have a really technical guitar solo. Shock horror. There'll be times where fast picking is just not necessary. It doesn't add anything to the song emotionally, spiritually, whatever the case may be. So sometimes simple is the best approach. But what makes a really mature guitar player is being able to distinguish between something that needs to be simple or something that can be a little bit more complicated. The best guitarist is not the guitarist who always shows off what he can do, but the guitarist who knows what to do and what not to do, given the musical circumstance. One who is able to hold back on speed or technique for the benefit of the song. If you lose perspective on how good your solo is, ask someone to come in and have a listen with you. If you lose perspective on how good or not so good your guitar solo is, get someone to have a listen to the solo and give you some feedback. It doesn't have to be someone who's musical. They can still give you a bit of an idea on what they don't like. Maybe it's that particular high note or so and so. And it's actually quite good to get input from people who aren't musicians as well, the general audience, who are not so much focused on the technique and the speed, and they're just genuine listeners. So it's always good to get additional feedback. Right, that concludes my lesson today on how to create really effective, great sounding guitar solos. I hope those tips were really useful for you. These are actually tips that I've created myself. These are my philosophies, my personal approach. They might not be the ones shared with everyone else, but this is what works for me. So this is my philosophy on things and the way I go about creating guitar solos. Have a go anyway, and let me know how you get on. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps out massively. If it's been of benefit to you, this video, please smash that subscribe button. Honestly guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. See you later.